The last shuttle was already gone when Danny Cole reached the docking bay. He stood there in the empty hangar, his breath heavy from running through the maintenance tunnels, and watched the massive doors seal shut with a sound that felt like a coffin closing. The emergency lights painted everything in dull red, and somewhere deep in the station, alarms were still screaming about the reactor failure that had sent everyone fleeing. They had left him behind. Danny was 34 years old, a mechanical engineer from a small town in Ohio who had taken a job on this alien station because the pay was good and because he had nothing left back home. His marriage had fallen apart 2 years ago, and working on the edge of known space had seemed like a fresh start. Now it seemed like an ending. The station was called Seven, and it belonged to a species called the. They were tall beings with scaled skin and careful minds, and they had hired Danny because humans were cheap labor and surprisingly good at fixing things. For 8 months, he had worked in the lower levels of the station, repairing systems that the technicians considered too dangerous or too dirty to touch themselves. He had been welding a patch on a coolant line when the reactor started failing. The work was deep in the engineering, far from the main corridors, and by the time Danny realized something was wrong, the evacuation was all ready. He had tried to reach the shuttles, but the lifts were locked down and the main passages were sealed. By the time he found another route through the maintenance shafts, everyone was gone. Danny walked to the observation window and looked out at the stars. Somewhere out there, the evacuation shuttles were heading toward safety. Somewhere out there, people were alive and warm and not trapped on a dying station. He gave himself 5 minutes to feel the fear, 5 minutes to let his hands shake and his eyes water and his chest tighten with the knowledge that he was probably going to die. Then he wiped his face, took a deep breath, and started thinking. The engineers had spent 3 days trying to fix the reactor before they gave up. Danny had listened to their discussions, picking up bits and pieces of their technical language, and he knew what they believed. The reactor was in a cascade failure. The cooling system was compromised. Within 72 hours, the whole thing would melt down and take the station with it. But Danny had also noticed something else during those 3 days. The engineers never actually looked at the reactor. They ran simulations and studied readouts and consulted their databases, but not one of them went down to the reactor chamber to see the problem with their own eyes. Danny went to see it himself. The reactor chamber was hot and loud and filled with warning signs in a language Danny could barely read. He ignored all of it and walked around the massive machine, looking at every pipe and conduit and connection point. He did not understand technology, not really, but he understood machines. He had been fixing machines since he was 12 years old, when his father taught him how to rebuild a tractor engine in their barn. Every machine, no matter how advanced, followed the same basic principles. Power went in, work came out, and somewhere in between things could go wrong. The trick was finding where. Danny spent 6 hours looking. He traced power lines and followed coolant pipes and studied every component he could reach. They had built the reactor to be beautiful and efficient, every part integrated with every other part in a way that was almost artistic. But that integration was also a weakness. When one thing went wrong, everything went wrong. He found the problem just before midnight, station time. It was a sensor, a tiny thing, no bigger than his thumb, buried deep in the cooling system. The sensor was supposed to measure coolant flow and report that information to the main computer, but something had gone wrong with it. The sensor was sending bad data, telling the computer that the coolant flow was too low when it was actually fine. The computer was trying to compensate for a problem that did not exist, and those compensations were creating real problems, which created more compensations, which created more problems. The solution would have been to replace the sensor, but the replacement parts were not on the station, and even if they were, installing them would require shutting down the reactor completely. Without the reactor, life support would fail. Everyone would die. Danny had a different idea. He could not replace the sensor. but he could disconnect it. He could bypass the automatic systems entirely and run the cooling manually, using his own eyes and his own hands to do what the computer was failing to do. It was a terrible idea by standards. Their technology was designed to run itself, to operate without interference, to be perfect. Manual control was primitive. It was dangerous. It was exactly the kind of thing that no engineer would ever consider. Danny considered it for about 30 seconds before he started working. The next 14 hours were the hardest of his life. He crawled through spaces that were too small for his body. He burned his hands on pipes that were too hot to touch. He rewired systems using parts he salvaged from other areas of the station, parts that were never designed to work together. He made mistakes and fixed them. He broke things and repaired them. He did everything wrong by every standard he had ever learned, and somehow, piece by piece, he made it work. When he finally finished, the reactor was stable. Danny sat down on the floor of the engineering bay and looked at what he had done. The cooling system was running manually now, controlled by a makeshift console he had built from spare parts and held together with welding wire. It was ugly. It was inefficient. It would require constant attention to keep it running. But it worked. He laughed then, a tired and broken sound that echoed through the empty chamber. He was still going to die out here. The station had no long-range communications, no working shuttles, and only enough supplies to last a few months. But he was not going to die today. He had bought himself time. Danny had always believed that time was the most valuable thing a person could have. Time to think, time to work, time to find a better solution. He stood up slowly, his body aching and his hands burned and bleeding. The station was quiet now, the alarms finally silent. Somewhere above him, the observation deck looked out at the same stars that had been there when everyone left. But Danny was not looking at stars anymore. He was looking at problems, the communications array, the life support system, the shuttle bay, 100 different things that needed fixing, 100 different chances to survive. He picked up his toolkit and started walking. They had given up on this station. They had run their simulations and followed their procedures and decided that there was nothing to be done. They were wrong. Danny Cole was a human, and humans did not give up. They fixed things, they built things, they survived. He had work to do. The days began to blend together after the first week. Danny Cole woke up each morning in a small room that had once belonged to a crew member. He ate breakfast from the station's food stores, meals of nutrient paste that tasted like nothing and kept him alive. Then he went to check on the reactor. The manual cooling system was working, but it needed attention every few hours. Danny had rigged up a series of alarms using parts from the station's entertainment system. They loved their holographic dramas, and their audio equipment was surprisingly good. Now those speakers screamed warnings whenever something needed adjustment instead of playing alien soap operas. After the reactor check, Danny explored. 7 was a massive station, built to service hundreds of traders and travelers passing through this sector of space. Most of it had been sealed during the evacuation, but Danny was patient. He went through every section he could access, one room at a time, making lists of what he found: tools, spare parts, food supplies, medical equipment. Everything went into his notebook, written in a mix of English and badly drawn pictures. The most valuable things he found were the data terminals. The station's computer systems were still working, and they contained everything they knew about their own technology. The problem was that Danny could not read their language. Script looked like a combination of geometric shapes and flowing lines, and the words were based on concepts that did not exist in English. Danny decided to learn anyway. He started with the technical manuals because those had pictures. He would look at a diagram of a machine and then read the words next to it, slowly building a vocabulary of engineering terms. It was like being a child again, learning to read by matching pictures to words. By the end of his first month alone, Danny could understand basic technical documents. By the end of his second month, he was reading the station's engineering archives. What he found there surprised him. They were not inventors. Their civilization was old, older than human history, and their technology had stopped changing thousands of years ago. They built things according to established patterns, designs that had been refined and perfected over countless generations. The idea of doing something new, of trying something that had never been tried before, was almost foreign to them. Danny had spent his entire life doing things that had never been tried before. Back home, he had learned engineering not from books but from necessity. When something broke, you fixed it with whatever you had. When you needed something that did not exist, you built it yourself. Danny had grown up replacing car engines with parts from different cars, fixing farm equipment with scrap metal, building things that worked even when they should not have. They would have called it primitive. Danny called it useful. He began making changes to the station. Small things at first. He improved the life support system by rerouting power from sections of the station that nobody was using. He cleaned filters in the water recycling system that had not been touched in years, doubling its efficiency overnight. He fixed doors that had been stuck for decades, lights that had been flickering since before he arrived, and a ventilation fan that made an annoying noise that they had apparently learned to ignore. The station started feeling less like a place where Danny was waiting to die, and more like a place where he might actually live. But he knew he could not stay forever. His food supplies would last maybe 3 more months. Even if he stretched them, even if he found more supplies in sealed sections, eventually he would run out. And even if he did not, the isolation would destroy him. Humans were not meant to be alone. Danny had started talking to himself just to hear a voice, any voice, in the endless silence. He needed to call for help. The station's communications array had been damaged during the reactor crisis. Not destroyed, just knocked offline. They had not bothered to fix it because they were already evacuating. Danny spent 2 weeks studying the system before he understood the problem. The array itself was fine. The problem was a power coupling on the outside of the station. A surge during the initial failure had melted the connections, creating a break in the circuit that the automatic systems could not repair. Danny could repair it. He had done similar work dozens of times, but the coupling was on the exterior hull, and the only way to reach it was to go outside. They did not do spacewalks. Their environment suits were designed for emergencies only, meant to keep someone alive for a few minutes while they reached a shuttle. They were not designed for hours of work in the vacuum of space. Danny would have to change that. He found a suit in one of the equipment lockers and spent 3 weeks modifying it. He reinforced the joints with metal plates. He extended the oxygen supply using tanks from the station's emergency reserves. He added tool holders to the exterior so he could work without dropping anything. The result was ugly, a patchwork of human ideas and alien technology, but when Danny tested it inside the station, it held together. On the 87th day of his isolation, Danny Cole put on his modified suit and stepped into the airlock. The outer door opened, and the universe stretched out before him. Danny had seen space through windows many times. He had watched stars and nebulas and distant galaxies from the observation deck. But seeing space from inside a station was different from being in it. Out here, there was nothing between him and the infinite darkness except a thin layer of modified alien technology. He started moving along the hull, one handhold at a time. The station's exterior was covered in handholds and maintenance rails, designed for robots rather than people. Danny's movements were slow and careful. One mistake out here would be his last. The damaged coupling was exactly where the schematics said it would be. Danny anchored himself to the hull and got to work. The repairs were not complicated, not really, just reconnecting wires and replacing a few melted components. But doing that work in a bulky suit, with gloves that made his fingers clumsy and a helmet that limited his vision, turned a simple job into a 4-hour ordeal. His hands cramped. His suit's cooling system struggled to keep up with his body heat. At one point, he dropped a small component and watched it drift away into the darkness, forcing him to improvise a replacement from other materials. But finally, after what felt like forever, the work was done. Danny made his way back to the airlock, his body exhausted and his mind empty. He sealed the door behind him, waited for the chamber to pressurize, and then pulled off his helmet. The communications array was online. Danny walked to the control room, sat down at the console, and sent out a distress signal. His voice shook a little as he spoke, recording a message that explained who he was and where he was and that he needed help. Then he leaned back in his chair and waited. Someone would hear him. Someone had to hear him. He had done everything right, fixed everything that needed fixing, survived when he was supposed to die. Now all he could do was hope that the universe was listening. The response came 6 days after Danny sent his distress signal. He was working on the atmospheric processors when his alarm system started screaming. Danny dropped his tools and ran to the communications room, his heart beating so hard he could feel it in his throat. When he reached the console, a message was waiting for him. It was not from humans. The message came from something called the Covenant of, a group of 17 alien species that controlled this region of space. Danny had heard about them during his time on the station. There were members, though not important ones. The message was an automated response to his distress signal, telling him that a ship had been sent to investigate. It would arrive in 43 days. Danny read the message 3 times, letting the words sink in. 43 days. He could survive that. He had already survived almost 3 months. But there was more information in the message, a data packet about the ship that was coming. Danny spent hours translating it, and what he found made his stomach twist with worry. The ship was not a rescue vessel. It belonged to a species called and according to the Covenant records, there were scavengers. They made their living by picking through damaged stations and abandoned ships, taking anything valuable and selling it to the highest bidder. They had responded to Danny's signal not because they wanted to help him, but because they saw 7 as something to be stripped for parts. Danny had no idea what they would do when they found him alive. They had been friendly to humans, but they were unknown. They might rescue him out of kindness. They might decide he was not worth the trouble. They might do something worse. Danny needed leverage. He had 6 weeks before they arrived. 6 weeks to turn the station from a place where he was helpless into a place where he had power. He started planning immediately. The first thing he worked on was the station's defenses. 7 had never been built for war. It was a trading post, not a fortress, but it had basic security systems designed to protect against pirates and thieves, force fields that could seal off sections of the station, heavy doors that could withstand weapons fire, a handful of small energy weapons mounted in the corridors. Danny made all of them better. He increased the power to the force fields, drawing energy from the reactor he had stabilized months ago. He reinforced the heavy doors with extra metal plating, welding sheets of hull material to their surfaces. He recalibrated the energy weapons, adjusting their output to levels that the original designers would have considered dangerous. But he did not stop there. During his months of reading the engineering archives, Danny had noticed something important about alien technology. Every species in the Covenant built things the same way, following established patterns that had been developed long ago. They improved on what already existed, but they rarely invented anything truly new. Humans were different. Danny had spent his life looking at problems and asking not how others had solved them, but how they could be solved better. Now, he applied that thinking to everything on the station. He built a new sensor system that could detect ships at twice the range of the original equipment. He created a communications jammer that could block signals at the push of a button. He programmed the station's maintenance robots to work as repair drones, fixing damage automatically using the techniques he had developed. And he built a control system that tied everything together, letting him manage the entire station from a single console in the command center. The work was hard and exhausting. Danny slept only a few hours each night and spent every waking moment building, testing, and improving. His hands grew calloused from the tools. His eyes burned from staring at schematics. But piece by piece, the station transformed around him. When the ship finally arrived, 7 was not the dying station they expected to find. The ship contacted him before docking, a harsh voice demanding to know who he was and what right he had to be there. Danny answered calmly, identifying himself as the station's only occupant and its current administrator. The captain did not believe him. Her scans showed that the station should have been destroyed months ago. The reactor failure should have killed everyone and everything on board. Instead, she was looking at a fully operational installation running at higher efficiency than it had in years. Danny invited them to dock. He met them in the main hangar, standing alone in the middle of the empty space. He had no weapons, no armor, nothing but his worn work clothes and the confidence of a man who had spent 4 months preparing for this moment. They were tall and thin, with gray skin and eyes that reflected light like mirrors. There were 7 of them, all carrying weapons, and they looked at Danny like he was something strange and unexpected. Their captain stepped forward. She was taller than the others, with scars on her face that suggested a violent past. "You are the one who repaired this station," she said. It was not a question. "I am," Danny replied. The captain studied him for a long moment. "We came here to salvage. There is nothing to salvage if the station is functional." "No," Danny agreed, "there is not." "Then why should we not simply take what we want by force?" Danny smiled. It was not a threatening smile, just the expression of a man who had prepared for this exact conversation. "Because the station's defense systems are currently aimed at your ship," he said. "If anything happens to me, they will fire automatically, and I have made significant improvements to those systems." The captain's eyes narrowed. "You are bluffing." "I am an engineer," Danny said. "I do not bluff, I build things." The standoff lasted almost an hour. They scanned the station again and again, looking for weaknesses in its defenses. They found none. Danny had not just fixed the station. He had turned it into something far more dangerous than it had ever been before. Finally, the captain made a decision. "What do you want?" she asked. "Transport," Danny said. "Take me to the nearest human outpost. In exchange, I will give you the schematics for everything I have built, every improvement, every modification, every new system." The captain considered this. Danny could see her calculating, weighing the value of his knowledge against the cost of helping him. "Agreed," she said at last. Danny nodded. He had known she would accept. There were scavengers, and he was offering them something far more valuable than anything they could strip from the station's walls. He was offering them ideas. 3 hours later, Danny Cole boarded the ship and watched through a porthole as 7 grew smaller and smaller behind him. He had spent 4 months on that station, alone and forgotten and fighting to survive. Now he was leaving it behind, but he was taking something with him, something that had abandoned along with him. The proof that humans could do the impossible. The journey to human space took 17 days. Danny spent most of that time in a small cabin on the ship, reviewing his notes and thinking about everything that had happened. The crew left him alone. They had gotten what they wanted from the deal, and they seemed unsure what to make of the strange human who had turned a dying station into a fortress using nothing but salvaged parts and stubbornness. The captain visited him once, near the end of the voyage. She stood in the doorway of his cabin, her reflective eyes studying him with something that might have been curiosity. I have been thinking about what you did, she said. The station was doomed. Our engineers agree that there was no way to save it with the resources available, yet you saved it. I did what I had to do, Danny replied. No, the captain shook her head slowly. You did what was impossible. The techniques you used, the modifications you made, none of them appear in any database we can access. You invented solutions that nobody else had ever imagined. Danny shrugged. Where I come from, we learn to fix things by fixing things, not by reading about how other people fix things. The captain was quiet for a moment. Your species is very young. You have been traveling between stars for less than 200 years, yet you can do things that races far older than yours cannot do. I find this difficult to understand. Maybe being young is the reason, Danny said. We have not had time to forget what it means to struggle. The captain did not reply, but when they reached the human outpost called New Providence, she wished him well with what sounded almost like respect. The debriefing took weeks. Human authorities were fascinated by Danny's story. They wanted to know everything about the station, the reactor crisis, the evacuation, and how he had survived. But more than the story, they were interested in his work. The schematics he had created, the techniques he had developed, the modifications he had designed using alien technology and human thinking. Everything was studied, analyzed, and eventually classified as valuable. Danny was offered a job with the United Earth Engineering Corps. They wanted him to work in a laboratory, developing new technologies based on what he had learned. The pay was excellent. The benefits were generous. The work would be safe and comfortable. He turned it down. Instead, Danny asked to be assigned to another alien station. He wanted to find more places that needed fixing, more problems that needed solving, more situations where everyone else had given up. His request was granted. Over the next 5 years, Danny traveled across known space. He visited stations that had been abandoned because they were damaged beyond repair. He worked on ships that were considered too old to save. He went to colonies that were failing because their technology could not handle the conditions they faced. He fixed everything. Word began to spread among the alien species of the Covenant. There was a new term being used in their conversations, a phrase that did not exist before Danny Cole was abandoned on 7. The phrase was human engineering, and it did not refer to any specific technique or technology. It referred to a way of thinking, a willingness to look at problems without expecting failure, a habit of improvising solutions instead of following established procedures, a belief that anything could be fixed if you were stubborn enough to keep trying. Other humans began to follow Danny's example. Engineers, mechanics, technicians of all kinds went out into the galaxy and found work that nobody else could do. They repaired ancient ships that alien crews had written off as scrap. They rebuilt failing colonies using materials that were never designed for that purpose. They turned abandoned stations into thriving centers of trade and communication. The Covenant took notice. Danny was working on a remote mining platform when the summons arrived. He was invited to appear before the Covenant's Central Council, a gathering of representatives from all 17 member species. The message said they wanted to discuss humanity's role in the galaxy. He arrived expecting a negotiation, maybe a warning to be more careful about spreading human ideas to alien cultures. What he found was something completely different. The council chamber was enormous, a vast space filled with beings of every shape and size. Danny stood alone in the center, feeling very small and very human. The council's speaker was an ancient whose scales had faded from green to silver with age. She addressed Danny directly, her voice echoing through the chamber. For 3,000 years, the Covenant has maintained stability in this region of space. We have done this by following established principles. We build systems that endure. We avoid unnecessary change. We preserve what works. Danny said nothing. He had learned that sometimes it was better to listen. Your species has been part of the Covenant for less than a century, the speaker continued. In that time, you have done more to change how we think about technology than any other member species has done in thousands of years. We have only tried to help, Danny said. Yes, the speaker's voice was dry but not unkind. You have helped. You have also shown us that our principles may be incomplete, that stability can become stagnation, that what endures is not always what improves. The speaker leaned forward, and every being in the chamber seemed to lean with her. We did not invite you here to punish you, human. We invited you here to learn. Danny blinked. Learn. Your species sees things that we have forgotten how to see. You build things that we have forgotten how to build. We would like to understand how this is possible. Danny thought about his answer for a long time. The council waited in patient silence. On Earth, he finally said, we have a saying, necessity is the mother of invention. We invent because we have to, because our world was harsh and our resources were limited and our lives were short. We never had the luxury of doing things the way they had always been done. We had to make things work with whatever we could find. He looked around the chamber, meeting the eyes of beings who had lived for centuries, whose civilizations had existed for longer than humans had walked upright. You have forgotten what it feels like to be desperate, he said. We remember, and as long as we remember, we will keep fixing things, even when everyone else says it cannot be done. The council was silent for a long moment. Then the speaker nodded slowly. Perhaps, she said, this is why we need you. Danny left the council chamber with a new understanding of his place in the galaxy. Humans were not just workers or traders or minor members of a vast interstellar community. They were something else, something that the older species had lost along the way. They were survivors, problem solvers, fixers. And the galaxy had a lot of problems that needed fixing. 20 years after Danny Cole was abandoned on 7, the station was shut down for the last time. Not because it had failed. In the decades since Danny's repairs, the station had grown into one of the most important trading posts in the entire sector. His modifications had been studied and improved upon by engineers from a dozen different species. New sections had been added to the original structure, designed using the techniques he had pioneered. The station that was supposed to die had instead become something greater than anyone had imagined. But nothing lasts forever. Trade routes had shifted over the years. A newer and larger station had been built closer to where the ships were now traveling. 7 was no longer needed. Danny attended the closing ceremony. He was 62 years old now, his hair turned gray, and his hands covered with scars from a lifetime of work. He had spent the last 2 decades traveling across the galaxy, teaching his techniques to anyone willing to learn. Humans and aliens alike had studied under him, and many of them had gone on to become famous engineers in their own right. The ceremony was simple. Representatives from 12 different species gathered in the main hangar, the same hangar where Danny had once stood alone against a crew of scavengers. There were speeches about the station's history, its contributions to trade and technology, its role in changing how the Covenant thought about innovation. And there was one speech about Danny himself. It was delivered by a young engineer named. She had studied under Danny for 3 years and had become one of his most devoted students. She spoke about what she had learned from him, not just the technical skills but the philosophy behind them. He taught us that every problem has a solution, she said. That failure is not an ending but a beginning. That the universe does not care about our limitations, only about what we choose to do despite them. She looked at Danny, who was standing quietly at the edge of the crowd with his hands in his pockets. He taught us how to be better than we were before. After the ceremony ended, Danny walked through the station one last time. Most of it had been cleared out, the equipment and supplies moved to other locations, but some traces of his work remained. A control panel he had rewired 2 decades ago, a section of hull plating he had reinforced with his own hands, the reactor chamber where he had first understood that he was not going to give up and die. He stopped in the observation deck, the same place where he had watched the evacuation shuttles disappear into the darkness 20 years before. He was not alone this time. His daughter Myra stood beside him, a young woman of 30 who had inherited his curiosity and his stubborn refusal to accept that anything was impossible. She was an engineer too, working on projects that Danny could barely understand. She had pushed human engineering even further than he had, combining it with alien techniques to create things that neither humans nor aliens could have built alone. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if they had not left you behind?" she asked. Danny considered the question. It was something he had wondered about many times over the years, especially late at night when sleep would not come. "Sometimes," he said, "I think about the life I would have had. I would have finished my contract, gone back to Earth, found another job. I would have been fine." He looked out at the stars, the same stars he had watched on that first night alone, when he had been afraid and certain that he was going to die. "But I would not have become this," he said. "I would not have discovered what I was capable of. I would not have changed anything." Myra nodded. She understood what he meant because she had grown up hearing his stories, learning his lessons, carrying his ideas forward into the future. "The universe does not give us the challenges we want," Danny said. "It gives us the challenges we need. What matters is not what happens to us, but what we do about it." They stood together in silence, watching the stars turn slowly outside the window. In the years that followed, human engineering would continue to spread across the galaxy. Danny's students would teach their own students, who would teach theirs. The techniques he had developed on a dying station would be refined, expanded, and eventually taken for granted by species who had never known a time without them. But the philosophy would remain. The belief that nothing was truly impossible, that any problem could be solved with enough creativity, enough determination, and enough stubborn human refusal to give up. That the galaxy was not a fixed system to be maintained, but an endless frontier to be improved. Danny Cole died peacefully in his sleep at the age of 91, surrounded by family and friends and students who had traveled from across the galaxy to be with him. His funeral was attended by representatives from every species in the Covenant, and the speeches lasted for hours, as being after being described how one human engineer had changed the way they thought about problems and solutions. But the best tribute came from his daughter Myra, who kept it simple. "He was abandoned and left to die," she said. "Instead, he fixed the station. Then he fixed the next one. Then he taught the rest of us how to fix things too." She paused, looking out at the crowd of humans and aliens who had gathered to remember her father. He was just one man, alone and afraid, with nothing but his tools and his will, and that was enough. The words echoed through the chamber, and everyone who heard them understood that they were not just about Danny Cole. They were about humanity itself, a young species in an ancient galaxy, always struggling, always fixing, always refusing to accept that anything was beyond their reach. They had left Danny to die because they believed the situation was hopeless. They had been wrong, and as long as humans remembered that story, they would never make the same mistake. Some problems look impossible only until someone stubborn enough refuses to accept it. Danny Cole had been that someone, and because of him, the galaxy would never be the same.